The bullet that killed Elvira Quinn's husband missed her by 3 inches, and she decided right then and there, standing in the red dust of Laramie with his blood on her dress, and every man in the territory watching her with that particular look. The one that asked what she would do now, who she would lean on, whose name she would take, that she would not give any of them the satisfaction of an answer. That was in the spring of 1878, when the Wyoming Territory was still wild enough to swallow a person whole if they let it. And Elvira Quinn was 26 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of stubborn jaw that made preachers nervous and gamblers cautious. Her husband, Thomas Quinn, had been a decent man who got tangled up with indecent ones, and the morning he died in front of the land office on 2nd Street had been the morning Elvira learned that the world did not arrange itself according to who deserved what. Thomas had deserved better. He had gotten a bullet from a man named Cord Dalloway who owed him $70 and preferred to settle the debt a different way. Cord Dalloway was in jail now, and Elvira had been the one to march into the sheriff's office and describe every detail of what she had seen with such precise and unflinching clarity that the deputy wrote it all down with his mouth hanging open. She had not cried in that office. She had cried later alone in the small house on the edge of town that she and Thomas had shared for 3 years, and she had cried with such thoroughness that when she was finished she felt something in her reorganize itself, some deep internal architecture settling into a new shape. And what emerged from that grief was a woman who had decided that belonging to someone else's story was a luxury she could no longer afford. Thomas had not been cruel. He had not been controlling. He had simply been a man who assumed that Elvira's life would arrange itself around his, and she had let him assume that because she had loved him, and because that was the way of things in 1875 when they married. But standing at his grave in the spring of 1878 with the Wyoming wind cutting through her black dress, she understood that she had spent 3 years being someone's wife before she had finished becoming herself, and now with no husband and no money, beyond what she could make with her own hands, the question of what she actually was had become very urgent and very personal. She sold the house. She kept the horse, a bay mare named Delilah who had the patience of a saint and the speed of something closer to a sinner. She took the $114 the house sale gave her, plus the $22 she had saved herself from taking in mending and alterations, and she bought a plot of land 4 miles outside of the town of Cassidy's Creek, which was smaller than Laramie and meaner and more interesting, situated at the base of the Laramie Mountains where the land went from flat and dusty to suddenly vertical, as if the earth had changed its mind. She had a plan, and the plan was a boarding house. Not because a boarding house was the only thing a woman alone could do, though plenty of people were going to tell her that, but because she had looked at the territory and seen what was moving through it. Cattlemen, prospectors, railroad surveyors, drifters, men coming west to find something and men going east to escape what they'd found, and all of them needed a bed and a hot meal and a roof that didn't leak. And Elvira Quinn was extremely good at all 3 of those things. She had been running a household since she was 14, when her mother died and she stepped into that role for her father and 2 brothers in the hill country of Texas, and there was nothing mystical about what she intended to do. It was labor. She was good at labor. She would be paid for it. The land in Cassidy's Creek came with a half-built structure that the previous owner, a man named Burl Hendricks, had abandoned when a silver rumor pulled him north. The frame was solid pine, and the foundation was stone, and Elvira looked at it the first day she stood in it and saw exactly what it could become, the way some people look at a piece of cloth and already see the dress. She hired 2 men from town to help with the heavy work, paid them fair wages, and spent the better part of May and June doing work that her hands bled for and her back screamed at. And by the 1st of July she had 6 guest rooms, a kitchen that was the best thing for 50 miles, a parlor, a porch, and a sign painted in her own careful lettering that said Quinn's house, rooms and board, clean beds, good meals. The people of Cassidy's Creek watched all of this with the complex mixture of admiration and unease that a capable woman alone tended to generate. The women were mostly kind. The men were mostly patronizing in the specific way of men who want to be helpful and cannot quite separate helpfulness from ownership. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Abe Collier who had known Thomas Quinn and transferred whatever affection he'd had for the husband onto a kind of protective hovering over the widow, stopped by regularly to ask if she needed anything, by which he meant did she need a man, and she always said the same thing, which was no thank you, sheriff, and poured him coffee, which was her way of ending conversations while remaining polite about it. By August, Quinn's house had a reputation. The beds were clean and the meals were extraordinary. Elvira could make 3 things out of dried beans and bacon that tasted completely different from each other, and she ran a quiet house with firm rules, no fighting, no gambling inside, and the kind of order that traveling men found either deeply comforting or deeply suspicious, depending on what they were running from. It was the 3rd week of August, 1878, when Isaac Hunter rode into Cassidy's Creek on a gray horse named Compass, with $60 in his pocket, a Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard, a leather satchel full of survey maps, and a reputation in 3 counties that he would have been happy to leave in all 3 of them. He was 30 years old, tall in the way that seemed like it had been going on for too long, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and the kind of sun-weathered face that made it difficult to tell at first glance whether a man was tired or thoughtful or both. He had been working as a surveyor for the Wyoming Territorial Land Office for 2 years, which meant he spent most of his time alone in landscapes that were trying to kill him, measuring things and writing them down, and then riding back to civilization to hand in maps that would eventually be used to divide up land that had already been occupied and fought over and lost by people who had no say in any of the dividing. And he had a complicated relationship with his own work because of that, which he thought about more than most surveyors did and spoke about less than most people in his position were comfortable hearing. Before the surveying, there had been 3 years in the Colorado Territory working cattle drives, and before that 2 years trying to farm in Kansas, which the weather had made clear was not a viable ambition, and before that the war, which he had come home from at 17, with a kind of bleak efficiency about survival that had served him practically and cost him something harder to name. He was not a melancholy man, but he was a careful one, and careful was sometimes mistaken for distant by people who hadn't earned the closer version yet. He came to Cassidy's Creek because the land office had a new survey job in the Laramie Mountains, 40 square miles of terrain that needed to be mapped for upcoming homestead allocations, a project that would take 2 months minimum and probably 3, and he needed a base that wasn't a tent, because his back had been giving him trouble since a fall from Compass in the spring, and sleeping on the ground had become something his body protested loudly. He had heard about Quinn's house from a man in Laramie who said the food was the best in the territory, and the landlady didn't tolerate fools, and Isaac Hunter had spent enough time among fools to appreciate both qualities. He rode up to the house on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was the particular deep blue of late summer at altitude, and Elvira Quinn was on the porch with a broom, conducting what appeared to be a personal war against the dust that blew in from the east. She was wearing a dark blue dress with the sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back in a way that suggested she had put it up quickly and efficiently, and had not spent a moment thinking about how it looked, and she watched him ride up with eyes that were measuring him with a kind of frank assessment that was unusual enough that Isaac found himself straightening in the saddle without quite meaning to. "Are you Quinn's house?" he said, and then felt immediately foolish because the sign was right there. "The sign is right there," she said, confirming his foolishness without being cruel about it. "But yes, I'm Elvira Quinn. This is my house. You need a room." "For 2 months," he said. "Maybe 3. I'm a surveyor for the land office. I'll be working in the mountains and I need somewhere reliable to sleep and somewhere to store equipment." She looked at him for a moment longer, the broom still in her hand, and he had the sensation, not unpleasant, just unusual, of being genuinely read, the way a document is read, with attention. $2 a week," she said. "Includes supper and breakfast. Noon meal you're on your own because I'm not running a restaurant. You put your horse in the barn around back. I have one other boarder right now, a schoolteacher named Mr. Hatch who is quiet and does not cause trouble. I expect the same from you." "I can do quiet," Isaac said. "I'm not sure about trouble. It tends to find me regardless of my intentions." "Then I suggest you improve your intentions," she said, and went back to sweeping. He was given the room at the back of the house, which had a window that looked out at the mountains and a bed that was the softest thing he had slept in since before the war. He lay in it that first night, listening to the silence of the house and the wind outside, and the distant sound of what he was fairly sure was a coyote making its opinions known, and he felt something in his chest unclench that had been knotted for so long he had forgotten it was knotted. He came down to breakfast the next morning at 6, and found Elvira Quinn already in the kitchen making biscuits with a focus that suggested she considered conversation an intrusion on the work. So he sat at the kitchen table and said nothing, and she said nothing, and they shared the silence in a way that felt surprisingly comfortable, like two people who had each decided independently that words were not required here, and found that decision validated by the other. Mr. Hatch, the schoolteacher, was a small, nervous man in his late 40s who spoke at great length about educational philosophy, and had apparently decided that Elvira was his primary audience, which she bore with the patient tolerance of a woman who had heard everything and classified most of it as background noise. He greeted Isaac effusively over the biscuits and asked several questions about surveying that Isaac answered briefly and honestly, and Elvira put plates in front of them both with the efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times and found it neither tedious nor remarkable, just the texture of her day. Isaac rode out to the mountains that first morning and spent 8 hours measuring elevations and drawing reference lines in the wind, and when he rode back in the evening his coat was covered in dust and his stomach was loud about its opinions, and he walked into the kitchen to find Elvira standing at the stove making what turned out to be a beef stew with dried herbs that smelled so good it genuinely stopped him in the doorway. "Sit down," she said, without turning around. "It'll be ready in 10 minutes. He sat. Mr. Hatch was already at the table, explaining something about long division to no one in particular. Isaac had brought in his satchel of notes, and he spread them on the far end of the table and began making corrections to his morning measurements by lamplight. And for a while the kitchen had the quality of a place where people were doing separate things but sharing the warmth of them. And Isaac found himself looking up from his maps more than once to watch Elvira move around the kitchen with that particular competence of hers that was like watching something work the way it was designed to work. She caught him looking once on about the 4th day of this and raised an eyebrow. "Something interesting in the kitchen," she said. "The maps keep drawing my eye to that shelf," he said, which was not true at all, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and there was a brief moment of mutual acknowledgement that passed between them like something that had been lit and then quickly covered. "The shelf has preserves on it," she said. "Nothing interesting." "No," he said, and looked back down at his maps. The weeks moved the way weeks do in working country, with days that were too full and evenings that were just long enough for things to settle. Isaac went out to the mountains every morning and came back every evening, and the shape of Cassidy's Creek began to arrange itself around him in the way that a place does when you're staying long enough for it to become familiar rather than temporary. He learned where the general store kept its survey paper. He learned which of the horses at the livery were reliable and which were theatrical about it. He learned that the woman who ran the milliner's shop was the sheriff's sister and had opinions about everything, and that the saloon on the south end of the main street had a piano player on Friday evenings who was surprisingly talented, and he learned that Elvira Quinn was known and respected in Cassidy's Creek in a way that was specific to people who have done hard things without asking for applause. He learned these things about her in pieces, the way you learn a landscape, by moving through it and noticing. He learned that she had been born in Texas Hill Country. He learned about Thomas Quinn from the sheriff, who told him one afternoon over a beer with the particular gravity of a man who considers himself a woman's protector and wants surrounding men to understand that Thomas Quinn had been killed and his widow had come to Cassidy's Creek on her own and built something remarkable and didn't need any trouble. Isaac told the sheriff he wasn't in the business of causing it, and the sheriff looked at him with the assessing eyes of his profession and apparently concluded that this was probably true. He learned from Elvira herself, in the accidental way of people who share a table for weeks, that she had managed her father's household for years before marrying, that she had strong opinions about the territorial land policy, and the way homestead allocations were being handled, opinions that made him sit up a little straighter, because they were informed opinions, based on observation and logic, not the kind of opinion that was just an emotional reaction to a complicated thing. She had been watching what happened to the land around Cassidy's Creek, the way small homesteaders were being pushed out by larger cattle operations with better political connections, and she understood the mechanisms of it with a clarity that embarrassed him a little, given that he was the one literally drawing the maps. "The survey lines you're drawing," she said one evening, 5 weeks into his stay, when the table was cleared and Mr. Hatch had retired, and it was just the two of them with the lamp between them and the night settled around the house. "They'll be used to decide what's available for homestead claims, won't they?" "That's the intended use, yes," he said. "And who decides which claims get approved and which ones get complicated?" "In theory, the land office. In practice, it's more complicated than that." She looked at him with those reading eyes. "Meaning the men with money and connections do better than the men without." "Meaning that, yes," he said, and there was something in saying it plainly to her, without the professional hedging he usually applied to the subject, that felt like putting down a weight. "Is that something you can do anything about?" she asked, "or is it just something you know and carry?" He was quiet for a moment. "I've been asking myself that for about a year," he said. She nodded as if this were a reasonable answer. "At least you're asking," she said, and rose to begin banking the kitchen fire for the night. He sat at that table for a long time after she left the room. What was happening between them, he thought, was not the ordinary kind of thing. It was not the straightforward attraction of a man who had been alone too long and a woman who was available and nearby. He had known that kind of thing, and this was different in its texture. It was more like the way you feel when you are working a problem that won't resolve, something that keeps returning to the front of your mind with the insistence of something unfinished. She kept returning. But she was also, very clearly, a woman who had organized her life around her own authority over it, and he was not so blind or arrogant that he couldn't read that. The boarding house was not just a livelihood. It was a statement. It said she did not need anyone to make her possible, and he had seen enough of the world to understand that a woman making that statement was doing so because she had learned, probably the hard way, that needing people had costs. He was not going to be careless with that. Elvira Quinn, for her part, was aware of Isaac Hunter with the specific and inconvenient alertness that she had been trying to talk herself out of since about the second week of his stay. It was not a feeling she welcomed. She had done her grieving, settled into her life, arranged things to her satisfaction, and she did not have a slot in that arrangement for whatever this was. He was a boarder. He paid $2 a week and ate her food and brought his maps to her table and asked questions that made her think. And that last part was the most dangerous of all because she could defend herself against charm. She was relatively immune to good looks, but a man who asked questions and then actually listened to the answers was a different kind of problem. She told herself all the sensible things. She told herself she did not know him well enough. She told herself the surveying job would end, and he would leave. She told herself that she had built something real and solid and her own, and she was not going to make the mistake of letting it become secondary to another person's life before she had even finished learning the dimensions of her own. She told herself she did not want to be anyone's answer, did not want to be the solution to a man's loneliness or the prize at the end of his wandering or the reason he finally put down roots. She had been someone's wife and loved it, and then lost it, and learned from the losing that you could not arrange your life around another person's permanence, because permanence was not a thing you could promise. She told herself all of these things, and they were all true, and none of them changed the fact that, when he was away in the mountains during the day, the house felt different in a way that had nothing to do with any practical matter. And when he came in at evening with the dust on his coat, and the maps under his arm and that quality of focused quietness about him, something in the house settled back into place. She was aware of all of this, and she was furious at herself for it. The trouble started in early October, when a man named Gideon Lark rode into Cassidy's Creek. Gideon Lark was the kind of man the territory produced in excess, broad through the shoulders with a gold watch he touched too often, and a way of talking to women that was all surface courtesy, and underneath it the assumption that courtesy was a transaction with an expected return. He was 35 and worked for the Meridian Cattle Company, which owned a substantial piece of the land south of Cassidy's Creek, and had been acquiring more of it through legal and occasionally less than legal means for 3 years. He came into town with 2 of his men and took a room at the hotel, not at Quinn's house, and began making the rounds of the town's establishments with the professional affability of a man conducting business that he didn't intend to fully disclose. Isaac first encountered him at the general store, where Lark was in conversation with the store owner about land values and asking specific questions about the homestead claims in the mountain foothills that were precisely the area Isaac had been surveying. The questions were specific enough that Isaac, who had developed a surveyor's habit of listening to conversations around property, paid close attention and then went back to his maps that evening with a different kind of attention. He found what he was looking for by the second night of looking. The survey request from the land office that had brought him to Cassidy's Creek was legitimate, but the specific parameters of the survey, which parcels to prioritize, which elevation lines to draw as claim boundaries, had been adjusted somewhere between the original order and the version he had received. The adjustments were subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss if you were just doing the work and not thinking about what the work was for. But the effect of them was to draw the boundaries in a way that would make several existing small homestead claims appear to extend past their legal limits, which would then make them contestable, which would make them vulnerable. He sat with this discovery for a full day before he did anything about it, because he was a careful man and he wanted to be sure. And when he was sure, he came to the kitchen at a late hour when the supper things were cleared, and only Elvira was there, finishing the last tasks of her day. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I think there's something crooked in my survey assignment." She set down the cloth she was holding and turned to look at him with the attention she gave to things she considered serious, which was a different quality of attention than her general alertness. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He explained the adjusted parameters, the effect they would have, the fact that Gideon Lark's questions at the general store aligned with what he'd found in a way that was almost certainly not coincidental. He spread the maps on the table and showed her the specific points where the lines had been changed, and she leaned over them and looked and asked precise questions and understood quickly, because she was exactly as intelligent as he had been slowly discovering she was. 3 of those homesteads that would be affected, she said. "I know those families. The Carver family, they've been on their land for 4 years. Widow named Mrs. Forsyth who came out with her son from Missouri. And the Garza brothers who run sheep and had enough trouble getting their claim recognized in the first place because the cattle men don't want sheep in the territory." "I know," he said. "What are you going to do about it?" He looked at her. Write a full account of what I found and send it to the federal land commissioner in Cheyenne, bypassing the territorial office entirely, and correct the survey to what it should have been. The original parameters, the ones before someone adjusted them. That will cost you the job, she said. The land office will not be happy. The land office, or whoever in the land office, is in Lark's pocket. Either way, she said. Either way, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something he did not expect. I'll write a letter too. I know people in Cassidy's Creek who have seen Meridian's methods before. I can document what's happened to smaller landowners in the last 3 years, supporting evidence. You don't have to do that, he said. It could make you unpopular with people who'd rather not have it documented. I've been unpopular before, she said. It did not kill me. He looked at her across the maps and the lamplight and felt that thing in his chest that had been unmooring itself slowly over the past 2 months tug loose entirely. He was aware that he was in territory, emotional rather than geographical, that he had not been in before, and he was also aware that he was less frightened of it than he had any right to be. Elvira, he said, and stopped. She looked at him with those reading eyes, steady and a little guarded, and he was aware that she was waiting to see what he did with the beginning of what he'd started. I don't have a good way to say this, he said, without it sounding like more than you want to hear, and I'm fairly sure it's more than you want to hear, but I've been sitting with it for a month and I'm not good enough at lying to myself to keep pretending it isn't true. Say it plainly, she said. I think about you, he said. In the way that means you've become the central fact of my thinking. I go out in the mountains, and I'm mapping land and thinking about something you said at breakfast. That's not something I can explain as being a normal boarder's feeling about his landlady. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire had burned down to a low red. I know, she said. You know that I think about you, or you know what I mean by it. I know what you mean by it, she said. I know because I do the same thing and I'm not happy about it. He might have been hurt by that, except that her honesty was one of the things he most admired about her, and he recognized that this was her being honest. Why aren't you happy about it? Because I built this house, she said, with a gesture that encompassed not just the kitchen but the whole structure, the sign out front, the work in the walls and floors and roof that she had done with her own hands and her own money and her own will. I built it so that I would be the answer to my own questions, not anyone else's questions, not anyone else's needs, mine, and I am very protective of that. He was quiet for a moment. He chose his next words with the care he gave to drawing survey lines, deliberately, knowing that where you drew the line determined what was included and what was outside it. I don't want you to be my answer, he said. I'm not looking for an answer. I'm not the kind of man who needs a woman to make him make sense. I've been making sense of myself on my own for 30 years, and I expect to keep doing that. She was watching him with something new in her expression, something that was not her usual frankness but was instead a kind of cautious attention, like a person who has been presented with a thing they were not expecting and are trying to understand its dimensions. Then what are you saying? She asked. I'm saying that you're not my answer, he said. You're my question, and those are completely different things. An answer is something you get and it settles. A question is something you keep thinking about because it keeps opening up into more. Every conversation with you opens into more. That's not me wanting to lean on you or own you or turn you into something that makes my life simpler. That's me finding you interesting in the deepest way I know how to find anything interesting. Elvira Quinn had made herself hard to move on purpose. She had constructed the emotional equivalent of good stone walls, because she had learned that walls were necessary for surviving Wyoming winters, and for surviving the particular vulnerabilities of being a woman alone in 1878. She was proud of those walls, and she stood behind them with the conviction of someone who had built them well. But what Isaac Hunter had just said to her was not a siege. It was not a man trying to find a way through or over or around what she had built. It was a man standing at the outside of her walls and telling her that he was not trying to get in. He was just interested in the architecture. And she found, somewhat to her own alarm, that her walls were not designed to handle that. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I need to think about what you've said." "That's fair," he said. "I also need to sleep. We both have things to do tomorrow." "We do," he agreed. She took the lamp and went up the stairs, and Isaac stayed at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, listening to the Wyoming night, which was large and cold and almost completely indifferent to human feelings, and felt that for the first time in a very long time he had said an honest thing to a person who deserved honest things, and had not immediately wished he could take it back. The next day he sat down and wrote his report to the Federal Land Commissioner in Cheyenne. He was precise and specific, and documented everything with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the legal value of documentation was in its details. He included the adjusted parameters, the original survey order, the comparison between them, and his assessment of the likely beneficiary of the changes. He sent it with the morning stage. Elvira, meanwhile, spent 3 days quietly visiting. She went to the Carver homestead and the Garza brothers' land, and to the small house where Mrs. Forsyth and her teenage son lived 4 miles north of town, and she listened to them and wrote down what they told her about the pressure they had been receiving to renegotiate their land agreements, the men who had come by with offers that were more like ultimatums, the small bureaucratic obstacles that kept appearing when they tried to do anything official with their claims. She wrote it all out in her careful hand, and added it to a letter she addressed to the same commissioner and sent with the next week's stage. Gideon Lark remained in Cassidy's Creek through all of this, apparently conducting his business dealings with unhurried confidence, which told Isaac that Lark was either unaware of what Isaac had sent to Cheyenne or was confident enough in his connections there to not be worried. Isaac suspected it was the latter, which meant the situation might not resolve quickly or cleanly, and he told Elvira this. "Then we wait," she said. "Things worth doing usually take longer than you want them to." "You are remarkably patient," he said. "I'm not patient," she said, with the ghost of something that was almost a smile but harder edged than that. "I'm stubborn. Those look the same from the outside, but they feel very different." He laughed, which surprised them both, and she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something that was noticing and self-aware all at once. He asked her on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after the night in the kitchen, if she would walk with him. He said it simply, without preamble, and she looked at him for a moment and then said yes, which was also simple, and they walked out along the edge of town toward the foothills, where the land started to rise and the late October air had a cold clarity that made everything look drawn in ink. They walked for a while without talking, which was comfortable in the way their silences usually were, and then she said, "I want you to know something." "All right," he said. "When Thomas died," she said, "I spent a long time deciding who I was going to be after it, and I decided that I was going to be someone who belonged to herself completely. Not out of bitterness and not because I thought men were the enemy or that love was a trap. I genuinely decided that for practical and philosophical reasons this was the right thing." "I understand that," he said, "and I'm not rescinding it," she said. "I need you to understand that. Whatever is happening here, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know what's happening here because we've established that I'm not good at pretending. It cannot happen at the expense of what I've built and who I've decided to be. I'm not asking it to," he said. "Men often say that and then don't understand what it means in practice," she said, not with accusation, just with the even tone of a woman who has observed a pattern and is reporting it. "Then tell me what it means in practice," he said. Specifically, she looked at him. "It means this house stays mine, under my name by my authority. It means if I have something to say, I say it, and you listen the same way you'd listen to anyone whose opinion you respected. It means I don't become secondary. To you, to anyone." "Elvira," he said, "I have been traveling through this territory for 2 years measuring things that other people are going to use to divide up the world, and in that time the thing I have wanted most, the thing I have been most aware of not having, is exactly one person who talks to me the way you talk to me. I am not remotely interested in making you secondary. I am interested in the opposite of that." They had stopped walking. The mountains were directly in front of them, the white of early snow on the highest peaks, the sky behind them that deep late October blue. "What is the opposite of secondary?" she asked. "Being the main thing," he said. "Being the point." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was different, not softer exactly but less defended, as if she had made a decision about where the boundary was and had stepped to a different side of it. "I believe you mean that," she said. "I do," he said. "I'm not sure I know how to do this," she said. "The particular arrangement of keeping myself whole while also letting someone in. I've never had to figure that out before. I've never had to figure out how to be with someone who required that of me before," he said. "So we're even." She looked at him for a long moment in that way she had of actually looking at a person, and then she said, "We should walk back. It's getting cold." "It is," he said. They walked back, and their hands found each other somewhere along the way, and neither of them made anything of it except that they both held on, and that was enough for now. The response from the federal commissioner in Cheyenne arrived in early November, and it was not what either of them had hoped for. It was a letter from a deputy commissioner named Holland, written in the careful bureaucratic language of a man accustomed to saying nothing while appearing to address everything, acknowledging that the concerns raised had been noted, and that the matter was under review, and that any decisions regarding the survey parameters would be made in due course following proper procedure. It was, in other words, a delay dressed up as a response. Gideon Lark received some kind of news around the same time, because his demeanor in town shifted from affable to something harder and more purposeful. He had a heated conversation with the sheriff that Isaac witnessed from across the street and could not hear, but could read clearly enough from the body language. The sheriff held his ground, which raised Isaac's opinion of him. Lark came to Quinn's house one afternoon when Isaac was away in the mountains. Elvira answered the door herself and found him on her porch with his hat in his hands and his gold watch visible, and his smile at the particular setting of a man who considers himself skilled at persuasion. "Mrs. Quinn," he said, "my name is Gideon Lark, and I work for the Meridian Cattle Company. I believe you've been writing letters to the land commissioner in Cheyenne." "I believe I have," she said. "I wonder if I might speak with you about that," he said. "There may be some misunderstanding about the nature of the company's intentions in this area that I could clarify." "I am not under any misunderstanding about the company's intentions," she said. "I documented them clearly in my letter. Was there something else?" His smile adjusted slightly. "Mrs. Quinn, I don't think you fully understand the way the cattle industry drives the economy in this territory. Land allocation that supports larger operations isn't just good for the companies. It's good for the town. More cattle moving through means more money in Cassidy's Creek." "More money in which parts of Cassidy's Creek," she said, "and coming at what cost to which parts? Because I've spoken to the Carver family and the Garza brothers and Mrs. Forsyth, and what you're describing as good for the town has a way of not being very good for those specific parts of it." "Those are small operations," he said. "Inefficient. The land would be put to better use." "Better use by whose definition?" she said. "Yours, the Meridian Company's." "I find that the people who most confidently define better use are usually the ones with the most to gain from the definition." Lark's smile had entirely reconsidered its position. "I would advise you to think carefully about what you involve yourself in," he said. "A woman running a boarding house in a small town has limited standing in these matters." "I have full standing," she said. "I am a property owner in this territory. My letter to the commissioner documents what I observed as a member of this community. There is nothing you can do about that legally, Mr. Lark, and if you attempt anything other than legal means, I will document that too, and I will send it to every office that might be interested." She closed the door. She stood in her hallway with her heart hitting hard and her jaw set, and she was slightly surprised to find that she was not frightened. She was angry, which was something she had always found to be a much more useful feeling than fear. When Isaac came back that evening, she told him about the visit in full, and he listened without interrupting, which she had noticed was something he was consistently good at. And when she was done, he said, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm angry. Anger and fine are compatible." "They are," he agreed. "What he said about limited standing. It was meant to diminish me," she said. "It didn't work." "No," he said, "it wouldn't." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think we need to do more than wait for Cheyenne. I think we need to contact the Cheyenne Daily Leader." A newspaper story about what's happening with the homestead claims might accomplish what the commissioner's office is being slow to accomplish. Elvira thought about this. "You'd be burning your bridge with the land office entirely." "I've been thinking about whether that bridge was one I wanted to keep," he said. "And I've been thinking about those families on their land and what your letters documented. And I've been thinking about the fact that I came here to draw maps, and I drew maps that were going to be used to take things from people who didn't deserve to lose them. And I'm not entirely sure I can keep surveying for an office that tolerates that kind of interference in its work." She looked at him for a long moment. "What would you do instead?" "I have skills," he said. "A surveyor who works independently, hired directly by homesteaders and small ranchers to document their own land, does useful work. It's less regular pay, but it's honest." "It's considerably less regular pay in the short term," she said, with the practical emphasis of a woman who understood finances clearly. "In the short term," he agreed. "I'm not asking you to carry that, Elvira. That's my own problem to solve." "I know it is," she said. "I'm just making sure you've done the arithmetic." "I've done the arithmetic," he said. She nodded, accepting this. "Then write to the Cheyenne Daily Leader." He wrote the letter that night, and she added her own account to it, and they sent it with the Monday Stage. The reporter who received it was a man named Calhoun, who had been covering territorial land politics for 2 years, and who wrote back within 10 days, asking to come to Cassidy's Creek to speak with them directly. Calhoun arrived on a Wednesday in late November, a sharp-eyed man in a city coat who was badly underdressed for Wyoming winter, but made up for it in enthusiasm. He spoke with Isaac and with Elvira, and then drove out to speak with the Carver family and the Garza brothers and Mrs. Forsyth, and came back with pages of notes. He spent 2 days in Cassidy's Creek, and then went back to Cheyenne, and 3 weeks later the story appeared on the front page of the Leader with a headline about the Meridian Cattle Company's use of manipulated survey data to pressure small homesteaders off their land. The story was detailed and specific, and it named names, and it caused exactly the kind of disruption in the Territorial Land Commissioner's office that the previous careful bureaucratic language had been designed to prevent. An investigation was announced. The original survey parameters were restored. Gideon Lark left Cassidy's Creek without fanfare, and the Meridian Cattle Company's expansion plans in the Laramie foothills encountered a year of legal delays that significantly cooled their ambitions. The Carver family stayed on their land. The Garza brothers stayed on their land. Mrs. Forsyth and her son stayed on theirs. Isaac Hunter submitted his resignation to the Wyoming Territorial Land Office in December 1878, with a letter that was professional and specific, and did not burn any bridges that didn't deserve burning, but made very clear his reasons for leaving. He was told by the acting commissioner, who was embarrassed and defensive in equal measure, that he would have difficulty finding work in that line again. Isaac said he understood and meant it in a different way than the acting commissioner intended. He stayed in Cassidy's Creek. He had enough money saved from 2 years of surveying government work to keep himself for 6 months without income, which he calculated was enough time to establish whether an independent surveying practice was viable here. He approached 3 of the homestead families in the foothills directly, offering to survey and legally document their land boundaries for a fee, and all 3 said yes quickly, because what had happened with the Meridian Company had made the value of accurate, independent documentation very clear to people who had previously assumed their land office paperwork was sufficient. He moved out of Quinn's house in January, because he had found a small rented room above the hardware store that cost him 30 cents a week and allowed him to keep more of what he was earning, and because he was aware that living in Elvira's house while whatever was developing between them continued to develop was a situation with a particular kind of pressure in it that he did not want to apply to her. He wanted whatever happened between them to happen on its own terms, without the proximity of the same roof making it feel inevitable. He told her this. "You're moving out because of me," she said, with an expression that was somewhere between amused and uncertain. "I'm moving out because I think you deserve the freedom to decide how this goes without me being in your kitchen every morning," he said. "There's a difference between a man you trust and a man who is simply convenient, and I'd rather be clearly one and not the other." She was quiet for a moment. "That is either very thoughtful or very complicated," she said. "With me it tends to be both," he said. She helped him move his things, which were not many, and when everything was loaded onto Compass, she stood on the porch in the January cold with her arms folded against the chill and said, "You know you are still expected for supper on Sundays." "I know," he said. "And I expect you to tell me how the independent work is going." "I will," he said. "Isaac," she said, and he turned from where he had just mounted Compass, and she was looking at him with that expression she sometimes had, the one that was past her defenses and had not been entirely chosen, something that simply was what it was. "I'm glad you said what you said to me, in the kitchen that night." He looked at her from the height of the horse, in the clear January cold, and felt that everything that was complicated and unresolved and still finding its shape between them was the most alive thing in his life. "So am I," he said. He rode to the hardware store and she went back inside, and the house had that different quality again, the one she had identified before and not wanted to think too carefully about, and she allowed herself for the first time to sit with it without arguing against it. January passed, and February came with storms that locked the mountains up tight and made surveying impossible, which meant Isaac spent February doing calculations and drawing up the documentation from his fall surveys and developing the kind of written records that homesteaders would need to defend their claims. And he did this work at a table in the Cassidy's Creek Land Office, a single room maintained by the town for official filings, because the hardware room above was too cold for ink to work properly. He came to Sunday suppers and she fed him and they talked, and the conversations ranged widely, about the territory and the politics of it, about Texas where she was from and Kansas where he had tried to farm, about the war that he had been too young for but not young enough to miss, about her father who had been hard and loving in equal measure, about what the country might become, and what it was costing to become it. They were very good at talking, the kind of good that takes two people who are each genuinely curious about things and puts them in the same room and steps back. In February, she told him about the night Thomas died with a directness and completeness that surprised her even as she did it, not because the memory was new, but because she had never before told all of it, the whole sequence, the way it had felt to watch a good man die for $70, and the way she had remade herself in the aftermath, and what that remaking had required of her. He listened without trying to fix it or minimize it or redirect it, and when she was finished he said, "You are one of the most formidable people I have ever met, and I mean that as the serious compliment it is." "Formidable," she said. "In the best possible way," he said. "The kind that comes from having done hard things and not let them hollow you out." She looked at him across the Sunday table in the lamplight with the winter outside and said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Something simpler," she said. "Men are usually simpler than they turn out to be, in my experience." "Is that good or bad in this case?" She thought about it. "In this case," she said, "it's inconvenient in all the best ways." March came slowly, the way Wyoming March comes, with fall spring days that made you believe the cold was done, and then nights that reminded you it was not. The mountains began to show the first edges of thaw, and Isaac rode back out with his instruments and his horse and his satchel. and the independent work was sustaining itself in the way that new enterprises sustain themselves when they're based on something real, not comfortably but adequately, with the kind of forward momentum that feels earned. He rode out to the Garza brothers' land in mid-March to survey the eastern boundary of their claim, and found that 2 of the boundary posts had been moved. Not recently, but deliberately, and in the pattern he had seen before, the Meridian Company's way of creating ground-level ambiguity that could be exploited later in legal proceedings. He documented everything carefully, all the original posts and their positions relative to the moved ones, and then he rode back to town and told the Garza brothers, and then went to find Sheriff Collier. The sheriff was interested and thorough about it, took his own notes, rode out himself to look, and told the Garza brothers that this constituted evidence of intentional interference with a legal claim and that he was prepared to pursue it. This was the moment Isaac understood that Abe Collier was a better sheriff than he had initially given him credit for, a man who could be protective in ways that were sometimes patronizing, but who also had a genuine commitment to the law when the law was the right tool. The boundary post situation was resolved within a month, with the help of Isaac's documentation and the sheriff's investigation, and the Meridian Company's local agent, who had been operating out of a town further south, was formally warned, and the post moving did not recur. Spring arrived properly in late April and brought new people through Cassidy's Creek, the seasonal movement of the territory's population, and Quinn's house filled up with boarders, 3 rooms occupied, which kept Elvira busy with the productive satisfaction of her house functioning at capacity. A traveling merchant named Danforth stayed a week and talked too much but left a good tip. 2 brothers heading west to prospect stayed 4 days and were respectful and ate enough for 6 men. A young woman named Clara Beale, 17 and traveling alone to meet her intended in Nevada, stayed 2 nights and frightened Elvira in the way that very young women about to bind their lives to strangers in unknown territory tended to frighten women who knew what that could mean. And Elvira sat with her over an extra cup of coffee and asked careful questions, and was somewhat reassured by the fact that Clara had been writing to the man for 2 years, and had family in Nevada who had met him and vouched for him, and saw her off with a packed meal for the road and a very direct piece of advice about what to do if any part of the arrangement turned out to be less than she'd been told. Isaac came to Sunday suppers and sometimes other evenings too, when his work brought him back to town before dark and the evening was long enough to make a visit sensible. He was becoming a known presence in Cassidy's Creek in the organic way of people who stayed, who showed up reliably, who were part of the texture of a place. The shopkeeper knew his name. The sheriff nodded to him. The women who met for sewing on Thursdays had formed opinions about him, and shared them with Elvira in the direct way of communities that consider themselves responsible for each other's well-being. And Elvira received these opinions with the patient courtesy of a woman who has decided to let things happen at the speed they happen at. On an evening in May, when the mountains were green again and the air had that spring quality of possibility, Isaac came to supper, and afterward they sat on the porch in the long mountain dusk, and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer you give is the answer I'll accept, whatever it is, without it changing what's between us." She looked at him. "Ask it." "I would like to court you," he said, "formally, in the open, in whatever manner suits you and feels right to you. I'm not asking for anything beyond that right now. I'm not asking you to promise anything or change anything. I'm asking if you'll let me sit on this porch and come to supper and take walks with you without either of us pretending that the reason I'm here is the surveying." She was quiet for a moment with the evening around them, the mountains going from green to purple in the lowering light. "The reason you're here is me," she said, and it was not a question. "The reason I'm here is you," he confirmed. "All right," she said. "All right, I may court you." "All right, you may court me," she said. "In whatever manner suits me and feels right to me." "Those were my exact words," he said. "I know," she said. "I liked them." The spring and summer of 1879 in Cassidy's Creek had a quality that Elvira thought about later as the warm center of things, the time when everything that had been tentative found its confidence. They were together in the way of two people who have thought carefully about what they're doing and have decided to do it all the way, with an openness that felt earned rather than assumed. He came to supper 3 or 4 times a week. They walked on Sunday afternoons, longer walks now that the weather allowed it, into the foothills and sometimes further, and she found that walking with Isaac Hunter was one of the best possible activities for a person who liked to think, because he was equally comfortable with the kind of conversation that ranged over everything, and with the kind of silence that was not avoidance but accommodation. She told him things she had not told anyone else, not because she had been hiding them, but because no one had asked with the particular quality of attention he had. She told him about loving Thomas and what that had been, and how she had felt the loss of it without letting the loss define the future. She told him about her years in Texas running her father's household, and how she had learned to cook from a Mexican neighbor named Donna Reyes, who had been more maternal to her than any blood relation. And she told him about the boarding house and what it meant to her, not just as income but as proof, as the thing she had done entirely herself and which was entirely hers. He listened to all of it with the attention she had come to depend on, and he told her his own things in return, the war that was always there in the background of men his age, not dominating but foundational. The way of foundation is not the house you live in but the thing everything rests on. He told her about Kansas and the failed farm, and what it had felt like to walk away from a thing he had tried to make work. He told her about the surveying and the complicated feeling he had about drawing lines on land that had been occupied before the lines existed, and the Comanche and the Arapaho and the Cheyenne who had been pushed out of territories that were now being surveyed and allocated, as if the pushing had been a natural process rather than a deliberate one. He said this with the honest discomfort of a man who had been part of a system he understood to be unjust and had not known how to exit it cleanly, and she did not excuse him or condemn him but took it as what it was, the honest accounting of a person who was still working out what he was responsible for. "The thing you did with the survey," she said one afternoon, "sending the report, resigning the newspaper story, that matters." "It was late," he said. "Things are often late," she said. "That doesn't make them not worth doing." In August, on a hot afternoon when the air was thin and sharp, and the mountains were a solid blue-green, they were sitting together on a blanket in the foothills with the remnants of a packed lunch between them and the town visible below like a small arrangement of order against the wild country, and he took her hand in both of his and said, "I love you." He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without decoration or preparation, and it landed in the air between them with a weight that was satisfying rather than frightening, the weight of something that is true. Elvira looked at their hands, her hand in his, and felt the full complicated truth of what she felt about him, which was large and specific and something she had been naming to herself in private for months, and she said, "I love you too." He kissed her then in the foothills in August with the mountains behind them and the sky very large, and it was the kind of kiss that two careful people give each other when they have decided to be uncareful together, deliberate and unhurried and entirely certain of itself. She pulled back and looked at him and said, "You are still inconvenient." "I know," he said. "I'm going to keep the house," she said, as if there had been an argument about it. "I would not want you to do anything else," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "Elvira," he said, holding her hand still, "I fell in love with you in your kitchen, at your table, in your house. Keeping it is not a concession. It's the architecture of who you are." She was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed, really laughed, the full version of it that she didn't deploy often, and he looked delighted by it, the way people look when they have caused something wonderful and are genuinely surprised by the pleasure it gives them. The proposal happened in October, on the anniversary of his first autumn in the Laramie Mountains, which neither of them had planned as a significant date, but which turned out to feel significant anyway. They were on the porch in the early evening with the first real cold of fall in the air, and the sky going its October colors, and he said, "I want to ask you to marry me. I want to ask it in a way that leaves room for what you told me at the beginning, that you belong to yourself and that cannot change." She looked at him. "Then ask it that way." "Elvira Quinn," he said, and she noted that he used her full name, which he did when he meant something absolutely. "Will you marry me, understanding that what I'm asking for is a partnership of equals, that your house and your name and your authority over your own life are not things I'm asking you to give me or give up, and that what I'm offering is everything I am, which includes a surveyor with complicated feelings about land policy and a gray horse and a considerable amount of opinions. And my word that I will spend the rest of my life being interested in you, in the way that keeps opening up into more." She had made herself cry so rarely in the years since Thomas died that the thing she felt in her eyes surprised her. She did not call it weakness. She called it accuracy, the appropriate response to a thing that was genuinely worth feeling. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He put on her finger a ring he had ordered from a jeweler in Cheyenne, a simple band with a small garnet, red as the Wyoming earth, and she held it up in the evening light and looked at it and then looked at him and said, "You chose well." "I always think carefully before I act," he said. "I know," she said. "It's one of your finest qualities." They were married in December of 1879, in the parlor of Quinn's house, which Elvira decorated with pine branches and dried wildflowers from a bundle she had kept since the previous summer. And the whole of Cassidy's Creek turned out in the way that whole small towns turn out for the events that matter to them. Sheriff Collier cried, which he would have denied to his dying day. Mr. Hatch, who had found a second year of accommodation at Quinn's house and had apparently decided to stay indefinitely, gave a short speech about the sanctity of intellectual partnership that was unexpectedly lovely. The Carver family came, and the Garza brothers, and Mrs. Forsyth and her son. Calhoun, the reporter from the Cheyenne Daily Leader, sent a congratulatory telegram that was read aloud to general approval. The ceremony was conducted by a circuit preacher named Alderman who was kind and brief, and who was intuitive enough to understand from the way these particular two people stood together that what he was witnessing was not a conventional arrangement, and adjusted the ceremony accordingly, keeping the words that mattered and quietly omitting the ones that didn't fit. Elvira Quinn became Elvira Quinn Hunter, which was not a name any clerk in Wyoming had ever written down before, and which the clerk at the county records office looked at twice before copying it carefully into the register. And she kept the boarding house sign exactly as it was. Quinn's house, rooms and board, clean beds, good meals. Isaac moved his things from the room above the hardware store back into Quinn's house, this time into the largest bedroom, which Elvira had added to a year ago, and which had windows on two sides and a view of the mountains, and was the best room in the house. The first year of their marriage had the quality of two lives settling into a combined shape, which is different from blending and closer to the way two rivers meet, each maintaining its character, but creating something new at the junction. Elvira ran her boarding house with the same authority and competence she had always brought to it, and Isaac ran his independent surveying practice with increasing stability, as his reputation for accuracy and integrity drew clients from further reaches of the territory. He was frequently away for days at a time in the mountains, and she ran the house in those intervals with no assistance beyond what she had always employed, and when he came back there was a quality of return to it that she found she actively liked, the particular pleasure of a person you love coming home, which was different from the relief she had felt in her marriage to Thomas, the relief of not being alone. With Isaac it was not relief at all. It was addition. The house was fine without him in a practical sense, and with him it was something more than fine. He brought her things from his mountain trips. Not gifts exactly, but findings. A piece of quartz with iron inclusions that made it look like it had a fire inside it. A hawk feather. Pressed wildflowers from high alpine meadows that bloomed briefly at altitude and were gone by the time the lower country knew they'd existed. He laid them on the kitchen table when he came home, and she always looked at them with the same attention she gave to everything he brought her, which was serious and genuine, and he loved her for that specifically, for taking seriously the things he thought were worth bringing back. In the spring of 1881, Elvira discovered she was pregnant. She had not been sure whether she had wanted children, having had so much practice in the role of caretaker already, having arranged her life around a kind of productive independence, and the discovery arrived with a complexity of feeling that she sat with for 3 days before she told Isaac. He came home from a 2-day survey job in the northern foothills to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, looking at something in the middle distance. "What's happened?" he said. "I am going to have a child," she said. He put down his satchel and sat across from her and looked at her with the fullness of his attention. "How are you feeling about that?" he said. "I'm still determining," she said. "I thought I was finished with feeling uncertain about things." "Are you well? Are you healthy?" "I'm perfectly healthy," she said, "just uncertain." "That seems reasonable," he said. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Yes," he said immediately. "I'm terrified, but I am also extremely glad, and those two things are coexisting at the moment without too much difficulty." She looked at him. "I think I'm extremely glad too," she said. "I just needed to work out that I was allowed to be." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You're allowed to be everything you feel," he said, "in whatever order you feel it." The pregnancy moved through the summer of 1881 and into the fall, and Elvira ran the boarding house with the same authority she always had, and was deeply annoyed by the number of people who suggested she ought to slow down, which she had no intention of doing, and was somewhat amused by Isaac's attempts to be helpful without being overbearing, which generally took the form of quietly doing the heavier physical tasks in the house before she had a chance to. In a way that was almost too subtle to notice, but not quite. "I saw what you did with the wood pile," she said one evening. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "You chopped 3 days' worth of wood before I was awake." "It's a good morning activity." "Isaac, I just like being useful," he said, and the expression on his face was so transparently at war between wanting to protect her and knowing she would not appreciate being protected that she found it entirely endearing and let the wood pile matter drop. The baby was born in November of 1881, on a cold, clear night when the mountains were white, and the stars were the fierce, close stars of Wyoming winter, with a midwife named Mrs. Crane who had delivered half the children in Cassidy's Creek, and treated the whole business with the competent matter-of-factness of someone who had done it so many times that she was its greatest authority, and had nothing to prove about it. Isaac was present through the labor, at Elvira's request, which made Mrs. Crane raise an eyebrow, but which was simply what Elvira wanted, and she said so plainly. The baby was a boy, healthy and loud, and red in the face with the particular fury of being newly arrived. And Isaac held him before he had even been 5 minutes in the world, and had the expression of a man who has discovered a previously unknown category of feeling. They named him Thomas James Hunter, Thomas for Elvira's first husband, who had deserved better and had loved her, and James for Isaac's father, who had been a steady, quiet man who died before the war and whose steadiness Isaac had spent his life trying to honor. "Thomas," Elvira said, holding the baby the next morning when the night was over and the house was quiet with the specific peace of something accomplished. He would have liked being remembered. "I think so," Isaac said from the chair beside the bed. "You didn't mind?" she asked, using the name. "I suggested it," he said. "I know," she said. "I know you did. I just want to hear you say you didn't mind." "I didn't mind," he said. "Thomas Quinn was a good man who you loved and who matters in your history and therefore matters in ours. The name fits our boy." She looked at him over the head of the baby, the small boy who was her son and his son, and also something entirely itself that neither of them had made yet by any choice, something that was just beginning to be what it would be, and she felt the fullness of her life, the specific packed weight of a life that had been built carefully and deliberately, and with all the difficulty that deliberate things require. "You are still the most inconvenient thing that ever happened to me," she said. "I know," he said. "You've said so on multiple occasions." "I mean it every time," she said. "I know that too," he said, with the smile that was one of his best qualities, contained and warm and entirely directed at her. The years that followed in Cassidy's Creek had the quality of real time, which is to say they were not uniformly golden but were woven through with the ordinary business of living, which is sometimes difficult and sometimes tedious, and sometimes transcendently good and always better than the alternative. The boarding house grew by 2 rooms in 1883, when the traffic through Cassidy's Creek increased with the growth of the cattle trade and the continued movement of settlers into the territory. And Elvira Quinn Hunter oversaw the construction personally and directed the carpenter with the specificity of a woman who had done this before and knew exactly what she wanted, which she did. Isaac's independent survey practice grew into a small but solid business, with 3 regular clients among the homesteading families of the foothills, and a growing reputation among the smaller ranching operations who had learned, through the Meridian Company incident, that independent survey documentation was worth paying for. He hired a young man in 1883, an 18-year-old named Eli Garza, the younger of the Garza brothers' nephews, who had a gift for mathematics and a desire to learn, and who became his assistant, and then his apprentice, and then, in several years' time, a surveyor in his own right, which was a development Isaac took a specific pleasure in, knowing what the land question meant to the Garza family and how knowledge and legal standing were their own form of protection. Thomas grew into a serious and curious boy who had his mother's directness and his father's attention to detail, and who followed Isaac into the mountains on his first survey trip at the age of 5, riding in front of his father on compass with an expression of enormous gravity. He was also very fond of Elvira's biscuits, which he inherited as if it were a passion and not a taste, requiring them at every possible opportunity, and demonstrating great patience and sadness when they were unavailable. In 1884, Elvira found herself pregnant for the second time, a discovery she greeted with considerably less uncertainty than the first, having established to her own satisfaction that motherhood was compatible with being entirely herself, and having received from both the experience of it and from Isaac the consistent evidence that she had not been required to give up one thing to have the other. This second child was born in the late spring of 1885, a girl this time, with Isaac's dark hair and Elvira's straight jaw, and they named her Margaret Rose, Margaret for Elvira's mother who had died when she was 14 and whom she had never quite stopped missing, and Rose because when she arrived the world outside the window of Quinn's house was in its May flowering and the single rose bush that grew along the south side of the porch, which had been planted by Elvira in the first spring after she built the house, was in full and extravagant bloom. Margaret Rose Hunter grew up in a house where her mother ran things and her father surveyed the mountains, and came home with quartz and feathers and dried flowers from high places. And the world she learned about women and men from those 2 people was not the standard version of it, which was something both her parents considered a point of pride. In the late fall of 1885, when the Wyoming sky had gone to its thin winter blue, and the mountains had their first permanent snow of the season, Elvira and Isaac sat together on the porch of Quinn's house in the late afternoon, the children inside with the warmth of the kitchen fire and the particular noise of a household that is full, Thomas making his opinions known about something and baby Margaret adding her voice to the general occasion. And Elvira had a quilt around her shoulders and Isaac had his arm around her, and the mountains were in front of them the way they always had been, ancient and indifferent and magnificent. "Are you happy?" he asked her, in the way he sometimes asked it, not from anxiety but from genuine curiosity, the ongoing question of a man who took the interior life of the person he loved seriously as an object of attention. She considered it honestly, the way she considered everything, not reaching for the easy answer but actually looking at the question. She looked at the house, which was hers and had always been hers and was still hers in every way that mattered. She looked at the mountains she had come to know the way you know a neighbor, familiarly and with respect for what you don't understand about them. She thought about the work she did every day, the labor of her hands and her mind and her will, and the way the house operated as both home and livelihood and community. The people who came through it and ate at her table and slept in her clean beds and went on to whatever their lives were going to be. She thought about Isaac, whose arm was warm around her, and who had said to her once in a kitchen with the lamp between them that she was not his answer but his question, and who had meant it and proved it in the living of it, the ongoing curiosity of him about her that was the most sustaining and extraordinary thing she had ever been given. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I am." "Good," he said. "I'm also cold," she said, "and I believe supper is going to require my attention." "It will wait 30 seconds," he said. 30 seconds, she agreed. They sat there in the 30 seconds in the Wyoming evening in the late fall of 1885, with the mountains in front of them and the warm noise of the house behind them, and the whole of what they had made together, which was not a simple thing and had never been a simple thing and was, for that exact reason, entirely worth the making. The house would stand in Cassidy's Creek for many more years, the sign unchanged above the door, Quinn's house in Elvira's careful lettering, and inside it the beds were clean, and the meals were good, and the woman who ran it was known across the territory as someone who had come to the Wyoming wilderness with nothing but her own will and her own hands, and had built something real out of both. And beside her was a man who had learned that the best thing in the world was not an answer you kept, but a question you kept asking. And the question that mattered most to him had her name on it, and he spent the rest of his life asking it with his whole heart open, and she spent the rest of hers being worth asking. Thomas and Margaret grew up to be good and capable people, which was the thing both their parents had cared most about, and Thomas eventually surveyed some of the same mountain land his father had mapped, carrying Isaac's instruments and Elvira's exactness in equal measure. And Margaret ran a cattle operation south of Cassidy's Creek with the same direct authority her mother had brought to everything, and neither of them was secondary to anyone, which was the inheritance their parents had worked the hardest to leave them. The boarding house outlasted many of the buildings in Cassidy's Creek because Elvira had built it well, had put good stone in the foundation and good timber in the walls, and had maintained it with the care of someone who understood that the things you build are only as permanent as the attention you give them. And long after the original proprietress had grown old and handed the day-to-day running of it to younger hands, the sign above the door still said Quinn's house, and the beds were still clean, and the meals were still good, and anyone who asked about it in Cassidy's Creek would be told the story of the woman who came out of the dust of a hard year and built something that was entirely her own, and the man who loved her for it, and what the two of them made together in the Wyoming Territory in the years when the West was still becoming what it was going to be. It was a good story. It was their story. And it had the best kind of ending, the kind that is not really an ending at all but simply the point at which a life has become so thoroughly itself that there is nothing left to resolve, only the ongoing daily business of being completely and entirely alive in a place and a time, and beside a person that you have chosen with the whole of your careful, deliberate, wide-open heart.